Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It was such a great honor for me to be here giving you a presentation on the measuring household finance in Thailand, which is very interesting. This is actually an excerpt from the paper I'm co-writing with Dr. Gritzler and Dr. Somrat. The paper is called Household Finance and Vulnerabilities, the Evidence from Collaborative Thai Household Surveys, which is expected to be released, hopefully, by the end of this year. And so this is a good opportunity to update you the progress from our paper. But let me give you a disclaimer first that the following materials that I'm going to present is just a preliminary findings, so it is subject to change later on. So here's today's roadmap for the presentation. I will start with the framework and structure of the analysis first, and then continue with the overall picture on Thai household finance data and surveys. And then I'll give you the illustrative example, which is like a talk of the town, Thailand's household debt, which is like a sneak peek of our full paper. So let's begin. First of all, why are we talking about the household finance? And why is it so important? So let's take a look at one side of the household balance sheet, which is the liability side or the debt of the household. According to the BIS data from both two graphs, as of the third quarter of 2016, which is the latest data, as measured by the ratio of its household debt to GDP, you can see that Thailand ranked among the top in the region here. And also, as well as the rise, the fastest rise, Thailand is also among in the region. So should this high and rising household debt be worrying? Many literatures studying the household debt on the macro level show that the high household debt could slow down economic growth and affects the financial stability of the overall country. But not many literatures are studying it at the micro level, which is very important for understanding the prevalence, intensity, distribution of the debt, and of course the household finance at the micro perspective. And this is very important, like Professor Townsend and Dr. Narapong said, that for the policy design, since each household might have its own characteristics and shouldn't be just generalized. So this is the main motivation and the objective of the paper I'm co-writing with them, and that is to study the household finance at the micro level. So we can see another side of the balance sheet as well, and we can see what actually is the financial health of Thai household actually is. So here's the analysis framework and structure of our full paper. Like businesses, household also has the balance sheet and the income statement. So we want to study the household finance in various perspectives. That is for example, like prevalence, intensity, vulnerability, and the distribution. And we would like to come up with the welfare outcomes, which includes both the return and risk. And what the data that we would like to have is the data needs to have two characteristics. One is in its granularity, and another is wide coverage that covers population across time and in high frequency. So what do we have in hand? We have two data sets. The first one is the administrative data, which is the Bank of Thailand aggregate data, and also the National Credit Bureau data that Dr. Somrat is working on, and she's the expert on this. And the household surveys, we have several of them. The first one is the socio-economic survey, and the second one is the famous Townsend Thai survey from Professor Townsend himself, and the agricultural household survey, which is done by the Ministry of Cooperatives and Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives. And the Bank of Thailand SES, which is the extra module attached to the original SES. And of course, the last one is the panel SES itself. I will speak on the detail later on. Then what is the pros and cons of these two types of the data sets? And as you already know that we are in the big data and era, and the administrative data is very popular right now due to its wide coverage and the accuracy. But this big data still lacks the very important data that is the informal sector. So the Bank of Thailand aggregate data or even the NCB data itself do not include this informal sector. Then what about the household surveys? Not only it includes this informal sector, but it also is appropriate for the policy design since it is a research-driven data collection. So researchers would like to ask any specific question like the attitudes or the opinions in the surveys that couldn't be found in the administrative data at all. But nothing is perfect, so household surveys still have some weaknesses. Some literatures attack the credibility of the surveys due to its data collection and the sampling design. So what I would like to say here is that the administrative data and household surveys complement with each other, and we need to look at both of them. Even within this big data era, I would say the survey is still useful. So now let's get used to the Thai household finance data and surveys. This is quite a detailed table that I don't have time for a 25 minutes presentation to elaborate on this, but I will only talk about the uniqueness and the limitation of each data sets and the surveys. And for the rest of the details, please read it yourself in the given handout. So for the administrative data, the Bank of Thailand aggregate data, which is collected from every financial institutions of Thailand, represents the macro picture of the household sector, while NCB data, as you know, is the panel of low-level accounts across Thailand. But these two data sets, like I said, have no informal sector. So it comes to the blue zone, to the household surveys. The first one is the socio-economic survey, or the SES, which covers like can be a national representative because it surveys like 52,000 households across Thailand. And it's accompanying the Bank of Thailand SES as well, which has more details on the household finance, but it's irregular and on an ad hoc basis. And they are all the cross-sectional data that cannot track the household over time. So unlike the accompanying panel SES, but the panel SES has its limitation as well on the very low frequency, as they have only 2005, 6, 7, 10, and 12. So comparatively, for the 1,000 Thai data, which is both in the annual and monthly resurveys, is the longest and highest frequency panel data that tracks down the same household on the detailed household finance over time. Though it might not be a good representative, I may say, of the whole country, but there's some much value in it. And last but not least, the Agricultural Household Survey, or AHS, that focuses on the agricultural household across the country. So I have to start, since I have only 25 minutes. I will have the example of the analysis by looking at three surveys: the SES, the 1,000 Thai data, and AHS, which focuses on the agricultural household. The time horizon is to look back at the last decade from 2007 to 2015, which is the latest data. And the illustrative example, of course, is the motivation of the paper, the household debt in Thailand. So first, before I start, I have to apologize that there are some minor changes in graphs and some numbers in the slides. So please stick to the figures on the slides showing on the screen. So let's begin with the helicopter view of Thailand household debt by looking at prevalence and intensity. To clarify, the prevalence means the percentage of indebted households out of the total population, and the intensity means the debt value of each indebted household. From the graph on the left, you can see that the percentage of indebted household have been decreasing since 2007, according to both the 1,000 Thai survey and the SES. But on the other hand, there's the opposite direction from the AHS, which is in the rising trend here. So looking at the percentage of the indebted agricultural household debts, we need to have an apple-to-apple basis. So we should take a look at the household that is the agricultural household in the 1,000 survey and the SES as well. So let's take a look here. We can see that only the agricultural household across the survey, the debt prevalence and of the agricultural household in both the SES and 1,000 has the same trend as they were in the previous graph, but only different in the percentage of the prevalence itself. And for the debt intensity, the picture is quite the same as the previous graph. So the debt prevalence that has different direction against both the SES and 1,000 is still puzzling us, that we are still in progress of finding it out in the paper. But one thing I would like to point out here is that the percentage of agricultural household in both the SES and 1,000 are around 20%, which is approximately 10,000 households in SES and 570 households in 1,000, against the 100% of 30,000 households in the AHS. So my preliminary point of view is that the AHS may be better representative for the agricultural households of the country, but it may not be true. It's just a preliminary findings. So the next measurement is the financial health of the household that is measured by the financial ratios, several of them. We have seen the financial ratios fluctuate over time, especially for the AHS, the green line. But for the recent years, since 2014, most of the financial ratio shows that the financial health is relatively quite, I can say, quite rather in control. For example, the delinquency head count here for the bottom right of the presentation, which the SES doesn't have this information. We can see a significant decrease in both AHS and 1,000 Thai survey. So let's continue with the distributional view on the debt portfolio in the latest available year, which is the 2015. We segregate the debt into formal, semi-formal, and informal sectors. Formal sector consists of the commercial banks, the specialized financial institution, which is the SFIs, and the non-banks, while semi-formal sector includes the cooperatives, village funds, and rice bank. And finally, the informal sector contains friends, relatives, community group, and money lenders, or some may call it the loan sharks. And from the Venn diagrams here, we can see that clearly the informal debt is just a small proportion in each of the household survey. Here. And the informal debt only ranges around like 4 to 8% of the total households across surveys. And another interesting point to make is that the number of the sources of debt, which means that this number is like the sector of debt, not the number of institutions or people that the household makes the loan from, just the sector. We see that not many households use various sources of debt, which is shown in the intersection area of the circles. So some may now ask, what about the apple-to-apple basis on comparing the agricultural households? I would say that the proportion is pretty much the same for the agricultural household in the SES and 1,000 as well. So now let's consider by clustering the household into groups according to age that we measured by using the mean age of all members in the household. And occupation, that is the main occupation of the household. the income, which we segregated it into 10 groups or deciles, and the area that's separated into urban and rural areas. So from the SES, which is on the first row here, we can see that the highest average value of debt per household falls into the middle-aged adults here. And for the occupation, it is the professional. And for the income group, it is the richest one. And for the area, it's the urban area that is more than the rural area. So please pardon me if it's too small to see it. But I hope that the slides that the given handout can see it clearly. The pattern is quite similar to the AHS graph on the second row as well, except that the largest average value of debt is mainly from the SFIs, as we see in the blue color here. That is like Tokoso or BAC, actually. So it's time for considering another measurement. It's the extensive margin, or the change of the debt prevalence from 2007 to 2015. So from the SES, we can see that the fastest growing prevalence measured by the growth of debt prevalence lies on the adolescent households, which the mean age is less than 18 years old. This quite makes sense because we can see the young households tend to be more indebted currently. And another interesting point to make is the deleveraging of debt. We can see that every occupation group is deleveraging its informal debt by the orange color here in the negative territory. But on the other hand, they mainly accumulate the formal debt. And looking at the income group, we can see the lower income groups are deleveraging its informal debt as well, while on the other hand, the higher income groups keeps accumulating its formal debt. And by the area-wise, both urban and rural households have the same pattern as well, deleveraging the informal debt and leveraging its formal debt. But if we zoom in on the agricultural households from the AHS on the second row, we can see quite different picture. For example, by age group, the young households do not raise much debt, but the older adults household both before and after retirement raise much debt, which raises issue for agricultural household that they may have the debt overhang. And the last one, the intensive margin, or the change of the debt intensity, the average value of debt, the change of it. We can see the pattern in the SES is quite similar to the extensive margin like we've seen before, while for the AHS, the debt intensity is quite increasing in some of the particular groups, like here. The time is running out, so okay. So here comes the highlight of this presentation. It's the beauty of the panel data. So by using the 1,000 Thai survey, which is the longest panel data of Thai households, we can construct the entry, exit, and existing status of being indebted each year by tracking down the same household since 2007. Actually, this is 2007 to 2015. You can see the proportion remains stable across the years, but the exit is more than entry proportion in the recent years. Here, the green dominates the red one because it's in line with the prevalence of the household that it keeps decreasing. And sorry again if the graphs are too small again. By segregating into the groups, we can see that it's quite obvious that the older household, this is by segregating by age group, the older household here has the leveraging or the exit the debt much larger than others, that may be because they pass away or the natural causes, as well as the younger households, which is in line with the high delinquency of the younger household. That's why they exit much. And another beauty of the data that we can see from the 1,000 Thai survey is that we can identify the switching effect between sources of debt. In each scatter plot, each dot represents each household. Let's take a look at the formal debt first, the formal debt composition. The x-axis represents the percentage of formal debt, but out of the total debt by each household in 2007, and the y-axis represents in 2015. And we can see that the most of the dots concentrates on the top right area here, which means that the household who used to have formal debt in 2007, they tend to stay in the formal debt in 2015. In other words, households tend to stick with the formal debt. But for the semi-formal debt in the middle here, most of the dots are on the left corner, which means that lots of households switch to the semi-formal debt from what they don't have, they have here. Which makes sense since the proportion of the village funds, which we categorize as the semi-formal debt, is significantly higher from 2007 to 2015, but there's no pattern in the informal debt. So here's the key takeaways. I would say that nothing is perfect, so each survey has its own pros and cons. So using collaborative surveys are important to understand the household in the micro level. And what we have learned so far that I presented is that the debt prevalence declines over time, but not for agricultural household if we believe in AHS. Informal debt also declines over time as well, and the proportion of the semi-formal debt becomes larger, mainly driven by the village funds. And more importantly, the household debt is substantially heterogeneous across age, income, occupation, and area. So from aggregate numbers, it's very different from the aggregate numbers that is looking at the macro level. So it means that the granular data is critical in understanding the prevalence, intensity, and distribution, as well as in designing policies. And last but not least, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, please look forward to the full paper, the Household Finance and Vulnerabilities, Evidence from Collaborative Thai Household Surveys, which actually have Kun Shonakan writing with us as well. And it will cover more broadly on the Thai household finance, and not limited only to the household debt that I just gave the presentation. So please stay tuned and thank you very much for your attention. ขอบคุณครับ